Okay, right, so let's get started. I'll put the slides straight on. Let me share my screen. Right, I'm assuming that you can all see that. Now this week, as Elizabeth just mentioned, I'm going to focus a bit more on symbolism in relation to what I've shown over the past couple of weeks. So the symbolism of ascent in relation to this diagram that you can see on the right, this diagram that Jean-Michel devised or rather rediscovered in 1971. Now, also, we'll look at some of the other things that I mentioned last week. I think also the week before, when the symbolism of the three faces on top of Philosophia's head. I'm going to talk a bit about that as well. And also a particularly interesting aspect of symbolism in relation to the magic square that I talked about last week. There's something very interesting going on there in relation to its talismanic symbolism, because that 3x3 magic square is a talisman. In the sense of it being something designed to invoke an astrological influence. So let's begin. Now, I want to focus a bit more on this theme of the squaring of the circle. This is something really which has been there for the whole of the past two talks that I've been giving. In the sense that the square symbolizes earth and the circle symbolizes heaven. And the association of the squaring of the circle is with bringing about a relationship between heaven and earth. And this, of course, is really what lies at the basis of the symbolism of the soul's ascent. Now, I talked a couple of weeks ago, and I think last week as well, about the coronation chair and how you have the circular crown and the cuboid stone. One is above the body of the monarch and one is below. And so you have this idea that they are these two opposites between which the ladder of ascent and descent stretches. And the ladder, in the case of the coronation chair, is the body of the monarch. Now, this image on the right, as you can probably tell, it's a gravestone. I actually took this photo last week. I was on a pilgrimage in Lindisfarne, just a day before last week's talk, in fact. And of course, as you can imagine, when I saw this gravestone, I immediately went over to get a photo of it. And I added the in memory, which of course is part of the gravestone, but I just thought memory in terms of anamnesis or remembrance in Platonist terms seemed like quite a good word to have in an image of compasses and square. The compasses or the dividers, as they are here, symbolize heaven, and the square or the ruler symbolizes earth. And so you have this symbolism of the two worlds joining together with the interaction of these two tools. Now, in that sense, the one who brings about the relationship between the two worlds is, of course, the geometer. And so in this sense, the geometer is the bridge with their head up in heaven and feet down on earth, bringing the eternal hidden forms of number into their revealed visible state. You're probably aware this is a Freemason symbol. This is used a lot in Freemasonry. And in between the compasses and the square, there'll very often be a five-pointed star, which is the blazing star, which is, well, seemingly an image of resurrection. And again, it's to do with the Venus pentagram, which I'll mention briefly in a while. And it relates really to the idea of the resurrection into eternity. And so the one who has managed to bring these two worlds together, the above and the below. Now, the way in which this symbolism of square and circle comes into our diagram is in the fact that the circle with a radius of 7, so that's a circle whose center is at the center of the Earth circle, and the circumference is going through the moon circle, that one there. That one has the same peripheral measurement as the square. You might remember last week I said about how a circle with a radius of 7 has a circumference of 44. And so the square also has a circumference of 44 because it has 4 edges of 11. So what this brings about is a relationship between the heavenly form of the moon, in this case, the first planetary sphere, and the earthly form, which in this case is that larger circle. So through their interaction, between which there are 7 steps, there is this ideal relationship between that which is above and that which is below. Now, if we think of this in completely practical terms, the way that we need to look at it is that that green line with the height of 7, if that were to become a radius, in the sense that if it was to go down horizontally onto the ground and for its base to remain in the center of the square base, then if you turned that green line around as a radius of a circle, it would give you the circle in question. So it would go like this. It would just sort of go on the inside of the corners of the base. So it is truly through this relationship between the above and the below that the circle becomes squared. Now, a good example of this symbolism of square and circle is in the ground plans of cathedrals, and it's particularly pronounced in the French Gothic cathedrals, which very often have these circular east ends. Now, if you look at the rest of the cathedral ground plan below the east end, it's just made up of squares and rectangles. And so what we see is the 4 corners of the earth. The square and the rectangle is always used as a symbol of earth in this particular way. But what we see up at the east end, which you could say is the summit of the cathedral, the eastern summit, is geometry that's based on a circle. And so you have this movement from one to the other. And in that sense, the whole of the cathedral is an ascent. Now, of course, the ascent moves eastwards in liturgical terms, and that's towards the rising sun, which is a cosmological image of Christ, the risen sun, as it were. Even if you're further east of Jerusalem, because sometimes it's said that churches face east towards Jerusalem, but even if you're further east of Jerusalem, churches still face east, because it is that cosmological orientation of the ascension of the light, or the rising of the light, and the illumination of the world as a result of it. Now, with Wells Cathedral, there's actually you could say there are 2 different ascents, and this is something that I'm going to begin with, because these 2 ascents go in different directions. One is the eastward ascent, similar to what I was showing in the French Gothic cathedrals, and that you could describe as an ascent towards the rising of the bright morning star, or in Christian terms, the resurrection of Christ, the resurrection into eternity. Christ is described as the morning star that never sets in the medieval proclamation known as the Exultet. There's a description of his descent into the underworld and then his rising as the morning star that never sets. Now, the other ascent in Wales, as we'll see, is one that goes northwards. And this really is something I've been alluding to over the last couple of weeks in relation to the way that the geometry is used here at the cathedral in Wales. So here are 2 pyramid triangles. What I haven't said yet is that there's also a pyramid triangle up at the east end, which brings about the pentagram star. Now, this is actually a completely different type of pyramid triangle, but it's one that's virtually identical to the 11-7 pyramid triangle I talked about last week in John Michel's diagram. Now, I haven't really got time to go into that, but I am going to give a Temenos Academy talk about the golden ratio geometry. So those of you who can make it to London, you'll be able to hear more about it then. But those of you who can't, there will be talks in the future, don't worry. And of course, it's all in the book as well. But the thing I want to show here is that within all of this square and rectangular ground plan at Wells Cathedral, there are these 2 areas based on the geometry of the circle. And what I mean by that is that if you draw a circle and then you draw a polygon inside it, you have, well, on the right-hand side, in the east of the cathedral, you have a pentagon. And on the north side, what we were looking at last week, you have the octagonal chapter house, which has what was known as a treasury below it. It's a 2-floor building. So you have, in both cases, you have this movement, this ascent of a pyramid triangle, which culminates at its apex with a circular form, or rather a form that's derived from a circle. So whereas you have all the squares and the rectangles throughout the building, you have these 2 ascents to heavenly places. Now, the one in the east, if you've managed to get to see my talk, Dante's Journey in Gothic Cathedral Design, you'll be aware that the one in the east, the Lady Chapel, is actually an image of planet Venus, or the morning star rising in the east. Virgin Mary is also known as morning star, but the risen Christ is really the main symbolism of resurrection, with this movement towards the east. But there's also this ascent to the octagonal area in the north, and this, I would suggest, relates to the ascension that happens 40 days later after the resurrection. And you also have a line, as you can see from this pyramid triangle, which actually goes from the entrance of the Lady Chapel up to this area here. So there is a direct connecting of this Venusian area, as it were, the morning star in the east, going up towards the celestial North Pole in the north, which is, of course, the central pivot of the eighth heaven, as I was describing it, I think a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about that. So that's really where this idea of an ascent northwards comes in. It's an ascent towards the celestial North Pole, which is the Stella Maris, which is another of these titles of the Virgin Mary. So the Virgin Mary is there at the center of the eighth heaven, with all of the stars moving around her. Not unlike the celestial rose in Dante's Commedia, where she's at the center of that rose, just prior to Dante's union with God. Now, I want to just very briefly go through the earlier stages of this journey of the soul through the cathedral, and you'll find this familiar if you've seen my talk, Dante's Journey in Gothic Cathedral Design. I just want to very briefly describe the first two stages, which do equate with the first two stages of Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, on the left, we have the beginning of the cathedral, which is planet Earth. So if I fade in an image of the Earth, you'll see how the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn coincide with the north and south wall of the building. So it's that tropical rectangle in the middle of the Earth, which is what actually defines the rectangle of the nave at Wells. And so you have an image of the Earth. So as you're walking through the nave, you're walking through the Earth from one side to the other, as Dante does in his Divine Comedy. Now, as you've seen, if you've seen the other talk, there's also an image of Lucifer just around the center of the Earth on this pillar here. So this is another similarity to Dante's Journey. And of course, it has to be borne in mind that Wells was designed about 150 years before Dante wrote his Commedia. So what we seem to be looking at here is some sort of an already established idea of an initiatic path or a journey of the soul, which Dante then externalizes in his poem. So this is the beginning of the journey through the Earth from one side to the other, passing by Lucifer at the center of the Earth, which is of course the furthest point from the planetary spheres and the divine realm beyond them. Now, having gone beyond the Earth, we then find our way into the choir, which I think I mentioned last week is the same shape and size as the Temple of Solomon. So I've put a diagram of the Temple of Solomon below the blue rectangle there. Now, this is the area where we have John Michel's diagram, in the sense that the baseline of the pyramid triangle goes east-west through the choir, and then there is that ascent northwards towards the chapter house. Now, the pyramid triangle that goes towards the pentagram at the east end begins from the east end of the choir. So both of these pyramid triangles really come from this Solomonic choir. And of course, King Solomon is very much associated with wisdom. And this really is part of, I think, what these ascents symbolize. They symbolize an ascent to the holy wisdom. The one going eastwards, you could say perhaps is an ascent to divine love, and the association of the morning star and Venus perhaps marks that out, whereas the journey northwards towards the moon, but as we'll see in a bit, also seemingly the eighth heaven of the stars is the one moving northwards. Just to say, I think I may have said in a previous week that in both of the places that Pythagoras went to learn about the liberal arts, the god of the moon was the god of wisdom. So that's Thoth in ancient Egypt, and Sin, the lord of wisdom, in Babylon. Now, as you move further east beyond this Solomonic choir, you have this movement towards these two chapels here. Now, these two chapels are dedicated to saints who are associated with the solstices, but they're also the saints who are the last martyr before the Passion and the first martyr after the Passion. So it's John the Baptist and Saint Stephen. Now, Stephen is associated with the winter solstice through his patronage of horses, and John the Baptist, his day has been known as Midsummer's Day for a long time. So you have this seasonal symbolism that fits in also with the Paschal Easter symbolism, because if these are the last martyrs before the Passion and the first martyr after the Passion, then the Passion itself is, of course, the middle path leading through the middle of the cathedral and culminating in the rising of the bright morning star in the east. You may be aware that planet Venus plots out both an octagram and a pentagram star over the course of an 8-year cycle. So you have resurrection, or in terms of Dante's Commedia, the return to Eden. And there's a whole lot of Edenic symbolism with this East End as well. Eden in the Far East, of course, that's how Eden is depicted on the world map. And the morning star rises in the east and the sun rises in the east. And it's also the place of the thornless rose, which is one of the titles of the Virgin Mary. The rose grew in Eden, but without thorns. And it was once humankind fell from grace that the thorns began to grow on roses. But let's look at this ascent northwards. Now, you'll remember this photo that I showed you a couple of weeks ago. This is the 7 liberal arts and medicine around Lady Philosophy, the character from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. This is at Laon Cathedral. Now, Laon is a very early French Gothic cathedral, but what's of interest to us here, it was one of the main centres of study of the 7 liberal arts. So the Laon Cathedral School, this is one of the main places where these subjects were studied. But of particular interest to me in relation to Wells Cathedral is that it was also a place where Adelard of Bath taught. Now, Adelard of Bath looks like a very likely person to have been involved in the design of Wells Cathedral. He died only about a decade before the cathedral began to be built, but he did a lot of traveling around the Middle East and Europe in search of knowledge about the liberal arts and also about astrology and cosmology. So this very big emphasis upon cosmology that there is in Wells Cathedral inevitably shines a spotlight onto Adelard. Now, the thing about this window that you're looking at is that it's on the north side of the cathedral. It's a very early type of rose window, as you can probably see. It's just what would be described as oculi. An oculus means eye. And in these early rose windows, they consist of oculi rather than petals like a wheel window. This is the early style. So this was made about the same time that Wells Cathedral began to be built, in about the 1170s, 1180s, that sort of time. So we have this association of the ascent through the 7 planetary spheres, or the 7 liberal arts, with the north side of the cathedral. And so this, of course, brings us back again to this association of the Virgin Mary as the Stella Maris and the ascent through the planetary spheres towards the 8th heaven and the harbour of salvation, as it were. That was the description in the Knights Templar prayer that I think I showed you a couple of weeks ago. So as you can see, the baseline of the pyramid triangle is going through the middle of the choir. It's following that east-west axis. Now, there's all sorts of symbolism that I've mentioned about this in the book, but I'm just going to go into certain aspects of it that I have sort of time to talk about. There's an immense amount in the book, there really is. If you're going to read the book, it will be something you can read over quite a long period of time, just small sections at a time. They're all quite short sections, but there's quite a few of them. Now let's first think of the chapter house as being the celestial rose, as described in Dante's Divine Comedy. The celestial rose is one of the final things that Dante reaches as he ascends through the heavens. Now, of course, with a chapter house that is octagonal, we inevitably have a mandala form rather like a rose, but we also have that movement of the stars around the celestial North Pole, which the Virgin Mary is at the center of, in the same way as she is at the center of the celestial rose in Dante's Commedia. Now, something that goes along with this association of the rose with the chapter houses, there's an inscription in the York chapter house. It's also in the Westminster Abbey chapter house as well. So it does seem to be associated specifically with these polygon-shaped chapter houses. The chapter house at Westminster is octagonal as well. Now this inscription, you can see it written there in Latin on 7 lines. Now I didn't do Latin at school, so I'll attempt to read this out, but anyone who knows Latin well perhaps will be able to critique my pronunciation, but I don't know if it's correct. Ut rosa flos florum sic est domus ista demorum. Now what this means is, as the rose is the flower of flowers, so this is the house of houses. So as you can see, it's very high status. And the interesting thing about these chapter houses is they're not actually consecrated. Now, this isn't because they're not important, and you can see just by the standard of architecture that they're very high places, but they're not part of the eastward moving liturgy. So there isn't a reason for them to be consecrated, but they are clearly very high in their symbolism. Now, another aspect of this rose symbolism, which again is really fascinating, this may be a tenuous connection that I'm making because it concerns a French cathedral. In fact, the cathedral we were just looking at, Long, where the north window has the liberal arts in it. There's a natural likeness between the ground plans of these 3 cathedrals that I've been showing you for the last couple of weeks, and a particular image of the Virgin Mary that appears in the East End window of Long. Now again, we have this possibility that Adelard of Bath is perhaps influenced or being influenced by some of what he sees when he's in Long. The thing about this particular stained glass window, this image that you're looking at is, you could say it's really the most important image in stained glass in the whole cathedral because it's at the center of the rose window on the east end of the cathedral. Now I've got an image from far back in the cathedral. If you can see way off there in the distance, there's a rose window on the east wall. Long is one of the few French cathedrals that has a square end, like the way English cathedrals often are. Most French cathedrals, as I showed you earlier, have a circular end, but Long, because it has this square end, it can have a rose window there. And at the very, very center of that is this image that you're looking at on the left. Now, look at where Christ is looking. He's not looking at his mother's face. He's looking at the rose. And the angel to the left also is looking up at the rose. So this rose is clearly very important. And of course, it corresponds in the ground plan to these chapter houses. Now, the next theme that I want to focus on is the instances of the number 3 that happen within this octagonal area at Wells. Now, of course, if we think of an ascent through the heavens in terms of Dante's Commedia, when Dante finally reaches the final point, he witnesses God in Trinitarian form. And so at the very peak of the ascent, there is perhaps inevitably an association with the number 3. Now, the number 3 comes in all different forms, many different forms really, in this particular part of the building. There's actually 3 levels. I said 2 earlier because there's only 2 that are used, but there is actually a 3rd level above the chapter house, which was never actually made into a room. It was finished on the inside, on the walls, which suggests it was going to be a room, but it hasn't got a floor in it. So there are these 3 levels. And of course, as a lunar space, the number 3 is really the number of the moon. Now you'll remember last week I showed this 3 by 3 magic square, which is associated with the moon as well. So here we have another association of threeness with this area. Now, the thing about this magic square, really interesting, it's actually, in terms of its talismanic use in the ancient world, it was used to alleviate the hardship of labor, as in giving birth. So women would actually wear it on their body so as to make childbirth more easy. Now, that does inevitably beg the question, why on earth is this in a cathedral building, if that is its talismanic significance? Now, I just want to make a suggestion, because there is this association of the Holy Spirit with chapter houses, and I'll go into that a bit more shortly. And so one wonders that if the Virgin Mary is the soul who gives birth to wisdom, then perhaps this is a place which is designed to actually allow the giving birth to wisdom to become more possible. Now, that's, of course, just a speculation on my part, but we do need to ask, why on earth would this type of a talisman be used in a cathedral building? Now, wisdom and the descent of wisdom is associated with the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. And so in this sense of there being 7 steps that lead upwards, they are helped and presented by the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit that you could say descend from above down to the below. Now, another example of threeness in these chapter houses, and this I think came up a couple of weeks ago. I think Lindsay asked a question at the end of the first session. I pointed out the 3 faces on top of the head of Philosophia in this image. Now, apologies for the quality of this photo. I think it's a close-up of a book photo. Now, you can see above Philosophia, so if Philosophia is in a certain sense associated with the 7 liberal arts, but she also talks about the arts as being subordinate to her as well. So beyond the anthropomorphic image, you have this higher place that has this higher view that looks, you could say, in all directions at the same time. Now, this brings us to the chapter houses at York and Salisbury. Above the bishop's seat in both of those chapter houses, again, both of which are octagonal, you have this 3-faced head. And as you can see, there's a female head at York and a male head at Salisbury. And they're specifically above the bishop's seat, and they are quite high up. So again, they're at a higher level, really, than the human body would be if standing. Now, a particular symbolism that I suspect goes along with this is symbolism associated with the Eye of Providence, as described by Boethius. Now, the Eye of Providence sees past, present, and future all in one moment. This is a line that Boethius writes about the Eye of Providence. What is, what was, what is to be, in one swift glance his mind can see. Now, this is also associated with Janus, the Roman god who had 2 faces looking in the 2 directions. But something that René Guénon, the symbolist, suggests is that there is actually a 3rd invisible face that Janus has, which looks at us in the eternal present. Now, this is a very similar idea to what you have with the 3rd eye in the Indian tradition, whereby you have the 2 eyes that look at the past and the future, and they look at the duality of the earthly world, whereas the 3rd eye, which is invisible, looks upon the eternal present. So he makes this correlation between Janus and the similar symbolism that you find in the Indian tradition. Now, of course, this also comes directly over into Boethius's description of the Eye of Providence because of the idea of past, present, and future, which in Hinduism is known as Trikala. That's, I think it's triple, I can't remember the translation, but it relates to those 3, those 3 all as one. So if we have an association of the Eye of Providence with these octagonal chapter houses, because they have this heaven's eye view, something that struck me, I mean, goodness knows if there's any connection here, but with that infamous image of the $1 bill of the Eye of Providence, which is always presented in a triangle, you have something very similar with the use of the pyramid geometry at Wells. Now, of course, this image in America has got caught up with all of the conspiracy theories, which I think we really need to, I say in the book how the one conspiracy that is true is the conspiracy of the ego to distract the soul from remembering the true nature of its identity. And this is really the conspiracy we need to be focusing on, rather than conspiracies out there, as it were. The idea of the truth being out there, the truth is in here if we actually attempt to engage with it. Now, this 3-fold vision of the Eye of Providence is something that appears to be architecturally created in the Wells Chapter House. And this also works at the Salisbury Chapter House as well. And it's to do with the pillar that's at the centre of the octagonal hall. Now, what you're looking at here is the east wall at the Wells Chapter House. So this is one of the sides of the octagonal room. Now, these 7 seats, there are 7 on each of the 7 walls that have a full set of seats. The 3 middle seats are the 3 most important church men, or I suppose church men and women now, with female bishops and deans. It's the bishop in the middle, and then the dean is on the left. The dean is the head of the cathedral, and the precentor is on the right of the bishop. So those 3 middle seats together have this very interesting characteristic in terms of what they can see of the chapter house. Now, if you can imagine that you're sitting on the middle seat, the bishop's seat, and you're looking out into the chapter house, you can see the pillar is in the middle and it's obscuring the bishop's vision of the door. But that is all that's obscured from the bishop's vision. The bishop can see every single seat in the whole chapter house. Now, if you think about it, if someone was sitting, say, on this seat here, and they looked directly opposite them, the pillar would be in the way of their view of the seats that are opposite. Now, what happens in terms of this threefold vision is that if we were to then move to the dean's seat, which is this one here, this is a view from the dean's seat. And as you can see, one of the doors has now come into view, whereas the other one has become obscured. But still, the dean can see all of the seats in the chapter house as well. Now, if we move over to the precentor's seat, which is here, the precentor is the deputy of the cathedral. This is the view that the precentor has. So just really the equivalent symmetrical opposite of what the dean sees. But again, the precentor can see all of the seats as well. So between them, these 3 people sitting in these 3 seats, they can see all of the doors and all of the seats in the whole of the cathedral, or the whole of the chapter house, rather. Now, if you move one more seat along from where we're looking from the precentor's view, you can see that we can now see half of the second doorway, but the seat which is to the right of that doorway has now become obscured. And this is then the beginning of obscured views of seats as you go all the way around the chapter house. Now, if we hop back again to the other side of the dean's seat, we have the equivalent thing happening there as well. So the seat which is here has now become obscured. So we have this threefold vision, which occurs as a result of these 3 people being together. And this is also another one of these quite common themes you find in Freemasonry, of how it takes 3 people to form a temple. 3 is this first number of 3, 5, 7. This is a set of numbers that are talked about a lot in Freemasonry. And it takes 3 to form a lodge. And that is a description of the 3 seats that you have in a lodge room, one in the east, one in the west, and one in the south, for the 3 points of the solar movement throughout the day. Now, with the pillar in mind, one of the associations that has been made about these chapter houses is that they are places where people are influenced by the Holy Spirit. And so in this sense, it's been suggested that the pillar at the centre of the chapter house is actually the Virgin Mary at Pentecost. The iconography of Pentecost has the Virgin Mary at the centre with the 12 apostles encircled around her. Now, if we think of this cosmologically, we of course then have the 12 signs of the zodiac circulating around the celestial North Pole, or the Stella Maris, who is the Virgin Mary. And so this fits again really with this particular type of symbolism that we seem to have of the chapter house as being a heavenly space that one ascends to. And of course, one ascends to this chapter house up the staircase that I was showing you last week. Now, there's a very early tradition, going back to St. Irenaeus, of the association of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit with the 7 planetary spheres. And so if we think of the ascent through the spheres, like I say, this is aided by the descent of the Holy Spirit. And you may remember when I showed you the image from the Hortus Delicarium, it suggested that the 7 liberal arts are inspired by the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. So all of these 7s come together in a way that is understood through 12th century Christianity, but looking back to ancient symbolism. Now, this world is encompassed by 7 heavens, in which dwell powers and angels and archangels, doing service to God, the Almighty and Maker of all things. Now, the heaven which is first from above and encompasses the rest, that of wisdom. And the second from it of understanding, and the third of counsel, and the fourth, reckoned from above, is that of might. And the fifth of knowledge, and the sixth of godliness, and the seventh, this firmament of ours, is full of the fear of that Spirit which gives light to the heavens. And so this is the description of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, as mentioned by Isaiah, and their association with the planetary spheres. Now you'll see that the sphere that's furthest out is the one associated with wisdom, and it encompasses all the others. So this journey of ascent is an ascent to wisdom. Now, very recently, I've taken quite an interest in the symbolism of the crozier, which, as you may know, is the staff of a bishop. And it's to do with the symbolism that it seems to have, which doesn't seem to get mentioned very much, which is the symbolism of the ascending serpent. Now, of course, the ascending serpent is a description of the risen Christ, the risen and ascended Christ, I would think. And so in this sense, the bishop is the earthly representative of that state, you could say. Now, you do find serpentine croziers in the Orthodox Church, which look like this. And of course, it looks very much like a caduceus. But if we look at the word crozier, as you can probably see, or as you may guess, etymologically, crozier it's actually the Anglo-Saxon form of the word crucifer. So a crozier is actually a cross. Now, you'll probably be aware that croziers are very often, or they have the appearance of being a shepherd's crook. And that is the association with them as well, that the bishop is the shepherd. And so that's why the bishop has the shepherd's crook. But there is also this symbolism of it being a cross and being an ascending serpent. Now, one of the ways that you can see that this correlation is there with the cross and with the Serpentine symbolism is with the readings on Holy Cross Day. Just the last Holy Cross Day was also the 800th anniversary of Dante's death. And so that was rather a surprise, because it's probably about the most appropriate day in the whole year that Dante could have possibly died on, because all of the readings are about ascent. And both of the Serpentine readings are read on that particular day. The first reading is the one about Moses raising the serpent in the wilderness. The second reading is the description of Christ's kenosis, his emptiness, his movement down to the lowest point, which leads to his exaltation to the highest point. And then the gospel is where Christ associates his resurrection and ascension with Moses raising the serpent in the wilderness. So you have this direct association of the cross with the ascending serpent, and so therefore also of the crozier with the ascending serpent. Now, this is why I've taken such an interest in this particular crozier, because it's a crozier which is actually in Wales Cathedral, and it belonged to Bishop Jocelyn of Wales, who was a 12th century or 13th century bishop, and he was responsible for quite a lot of the building work of the cathedral. And there's a local dragon legend about him. He slayed the dragon of Warminster back in the 13th century. Warminster is a village just outside of Wales, and of course it has worm in its name, which is quite common when you have a local dragon legend. Worm is the Anglo-Saxon word for serpent or dragon. Now, as you can see, the shepherd's crook in this case is very directly a serpent. But when you look at a lot of medieval croziers, the shepherd's crook shape is often, at the very least, it will have some sort of a head at the end of it, or it does look as if it's a live form. So I'm sort of thinking that there is a possibility that there's possibly two different meanings to a crozier. And perhaps a higher meaning is perhaps that it is the ascending serpent, and it obviously has that appearance as a shepherd's crook. Now, in this instance, the one that you're looking at here has these two different serpent storylines in it, because it has St. Michael slaying the serpent or the dragon, which you could say is the beginning of the process. That's when there's the fall from heaven and the movement down into the underworld. But then you also have the journey which counteracts that and which brings about the original state again, which is the ascending serpent, which is the resurrected and ascended Christ. So both of these stories take place in the one crozier. Now, if we think of this journey northwards to this octagonal area, as you can see, there's just walls here. You can't go through walls. So you can't go through this sevenfold ascent in physical terms, but there is actually a journey that you can take of 7 stages that goes through to this octagonal area. Now, this is the area below. This is the undercroft. And this journey through here, through the sacristy, which of course is the place where the clergy would be, this appears possibly to relate to this third stage, this stage of ascent. And it takes you through a doorway, which interestingly is at the golden section of its wall. And then the doorway that you pass through here, which actually is where the edge of the pyramid triangle goes through, that also is at the golden section of its wall. Now, I've written quite a lot about this in the book, but the thing about this sacristy area, let me just put in some of the lines of the pyramid triangle. So this is the height of the pyramid triangle, and here is half of the baseline. So as you can see, this line here would go right through the doorway into the octagonal area of the building. Now, this is where we need to look at the pyramid triangle as a golden ratio pyramid triangle. And the reason for doing this is because we need to mark a golden section line like so. Now, this golden section line goes right through the golden section doorway, and it cuts it at exactly 1/3 to 2/3. Now, this is all in the book. It's all very detailed measurements and theory, and it works beautifully, just the way it all adds up mathematically. Now, here is the doorway. This is the doorway to the sacristy. Now, as you can see, it's off center within its bay, and that's because the middle axis, the middle vertical axis that goes down here, is precisely at the golden section between these two pillars. Now, the golden section is a particular mathematical relationship which consists of a lesser part and a greater part. So you could say that the lesser part goes from this pillar to the middle axis of the doorway, and then the greater part from the middle axis of the doorway to here. Now, there's a whole load I could say about that, but there's not enough time to go into that. I did give a talk for the Centre for Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred about this golden ratio aspect and an ascent eastwards. But for this particular example that I want to give, this sevenfold journey that goes through the sacristy, it goes under 7 bosses as you walk through the sacristy. And here they are. So they're naturally aligned with these 7 points in the vault. It's quite a low vault. It's more of a room rather than a hall with a high ceiling. Now, another form that I want to show you and describe to you is where this blue mark is. That's just as you go into the room, just before you get to the first boss. And then there's also 2 more carvings that I want to show you on either side of the doorway. And that's what we'll begin with. So where those 2 green marks are, that's the beginning of our journey northwards. Now, you see on the arch of the doorway there are these 2 faces, one male and one female. Now, this immediately makes me think of a particular form of Janus, the gods that I described earlier. Sometimes Janus is depicted as a male face and a female face, known as Jana or Janus and Jana. Now, Jana is Diana, the goddess of the moon. So you have, at the beginning of this journey, you have this middle way between the sun and the moon, rather like the way of the cross, which has the sun and the moon on either side. But however we view it, there is clearly this pathway between symbolic opposites, because of course there'd have been no women going into this room in the medieval era, because it would have all been male priests, but you have a female face and a male face, and the middle path that flows between them. Now, this first carving that you get to on the right, that's the one that was marked with the blue spot that I put onto the ground plan. Now, I don't know how clear this is, but this face, fascinating image. This face has inflated cheeks. So imagine if you blow your cheeks up with loads of air, and so you have a bulging face. That's what this particular figure looks like. Now, a particular characteristic that he has are these three forelocks on his head. Now, there's one missing that should be here, but he has these three forelocks. Now, it's these three forelocks that suggest that the first boss that we're about to get to, the first of the 7 bosses, is actually another image of this figure, but in, I suppose, a transformed state. Now, as you can see, there are these three forelocks again, but this bulging face, these bulging cheeks, what has burst forth from them is this viriditas of greenness into a green man. And so in this sense, I can't help but think that the greenness is, I suppose, is describing a particular inner state of soul that is moving outwards. This is showing itself on the outside. This greenness is welling up within the soul. And you could say that this is an image of someone for whom the morning star has risen in their hearts. This is one of these Christian descriptions of a spiritual state of soul that Peter gives in his epistle. The morning star is, of course, associated with springtime, as is the greenness and the viriditas of the soul. Now, it would take a bit too long for me to show you all of the bosses, but I'm going to hop forward to the 6th one. And that shows these two forms that keep on showing themselves throughout the sacristy, and they're these two serpentine forms. Now, as you can see here, they're both in an Ouroboros state. They're both sort of biting, they're biting their own wing, but they're also entwined around one another. So this inevitably has a symbolism concerning the union of duality. Now, with this in mind, and with the male and the female face that I showed you at the beginning of the doorway, the 7th and final boss, interestingly, shows a male and a female, and they have these dragon forms again, which are sort of nibbling the top of their heads. So goodness knows what that means. You can come to your own conclusions on that. But various of the bosses do seem to have symbolism either relating to resurrection and rebirth or the union of opposites. And so inevitably, it looks as though it has some kind of a symbolic dimension to it as one walks underneath these 7 bosses on your way to the octagonal area, which is through this doorway at the back of the sacristy. Now, something that's particularly intriguing about this is that where this golden ratio line begins from, there's something quite significant in the ground there. It's actually the grave of Bishop Jocelyn, the dragon-slaying bishop who has that serpentine crozier. So he seems to be aligned with this doorway, moving northwards. He was also placed directly in front of where the altar was at that time, which was further eastwards. So all sorts of very interesting apparent symbolism, but of course, as usual, nothing written anywhere about it, or just a few clues written from which we can perhaps construe certain ideas. But really, as you can see with what I've been talking about for the last few weeks, the things I've been talking about are very much from a perspective of symbolism that comes through an engagement with visual forms. And so rather than being art history, it's more to do with the direct engagement in practice and the recognizing of symbolism, or at least the suggestion of symbols through what we can see in the ground plan of a building. Now, something that's just come up, so what I'll finish off with is something that's only come up in the last few weeks. So it's too late to be in the book, I think, because the book has to be ready in a few weeks' time now for printing. But what all of this seems to point to is some kind of astrological symbolism concerning what are known as the nodes of the moon. Now, these are very significant within astrology. Within Vedic astrology in India, they relate to sort of two opposites. They're talked about as being the dragon's head and the dragon's tail. Now, they have this multifaceted symbolism, but when that symbolism came through into the medieval Arab world, they took on a sort of dual symbolism where you had the north node as being positive and the south node as being negative. Now, it's not quite the same as that in the Indian understanding of it, but this is what came into the Islamic understanding of it, which would have then been what would have influenced the Christian understanding of it, because of the movement through of the astrological knowledge from the Middle East into Europe. Now, the nodes of the moon are where the path of the moon crosses the path of the Earth around the sun. Now, you may remember I mentioned this last week because this is actually how you find the inclination of the moon. So that 5.15 degree angle of the moon actually comes from looking at the nodes of the moon. Now, the nodes of the moon are where the eclipses take place, because as you can probably see, this is inevitably going to be where the sun, the moon, and the Earth are all going to be in a straight line. So the nodes of the moon are very important for that reason. And it was actually through looking at eclipses that Hipparchus, the Greek astronomer, worked out the inclination of the moon back in about the, I think, 2nd or 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC. So this has been known about, or we know it's been known about since the 2nd century BC, but because it doesn't require modern technology, it could have been known about a lot longer than that as well. So the things that we have, which seem to be symbolically corresponding to what we're looking at here, the astrological symbolism includes both the moon and the zodiac, because the nodes of the moon are also associated with moving around the zodiac. So in that sense, you have both the moon and the zodiac in the 8th heaven associated with this one place, this octagonal chapter house in the north. Now, we also have the Serpentine symbolism of the ascending serpent, because the north side, which is of course where the chapter house is, that's seen as being the auspicious side, and it's also the ascending side, it's the ascending node. Whereas the dragon's tail is seen as being the inauspicious, and it's the descending one, and that's in the south. And as I mentioned before, this association of the 5.15 degree angle, which you see in this vestibule and also in the whole orientation of the York chapter house, and also at Southall, as I showed you last week, that also seems to be part of this symbolism of the lunar nodes. Now, beyond that, I don't know. That's as far as I've gone so far. But even though the book is about to be published, this is still an ongoing journey. So more about that at some point in the future. So thanks for coming to this this story in stone. I hope you've enjoyed it. There's an immense amount more than what I've shown you in the book. There's such a lot in the book, and it won't be a book that you'd read cover to cover in a short space of time. You just take short sections and gradually let it soak in, because there's it covers a lot of symbolism and geometry, but also it goes into a lot of quite fine mathematical detail in part 3. There's 4 parts in the book. Part 3 has all the mathematical detail. So if maths is something you find difficult, then you're welcome to flick over part 3. But I'm going to be making some slideshows to go with part 3 that will be on a website. So, hoping to make it easier to understand.
Thank you so